Hi there. I've been a Democrat pretty much all my life. I have voted in 12 presidential elections, starting with George McGovern in 1972, the year I turned 18. I have voted for the Democratic ticket every 4 years until the election of 2016, when I voted for the Republican ticket for the first time in my life. First, a little background. My interest in politics started with my interest in advancing women's rights. I vividly remember reading an August 1970 issue of Time magazine that celebrated the 50th anniversary of women's right to vote. There were lots of articles about women who were involved in the new feminist community. And I wanted to be part of that. Remember, at that time, 1970, there were a lot of laws on the books that discriminated against women. It is absolutely not like it is today, where pretty much everything is open to women, and overt discrimination no longer exists in this country. That, by the way, is probably going to be the subject of another video. Anyway, I started college in my hometown, and when I heard that a whole slew of new jobs in the military had opened up to women, I decided to join the Air Force. And I became an avionics technician for the F-111 aircraft. After I got out, I was able to support myself on the GI Bill while I got my electrical engineering degree from Cal Poly Pomona. After graduating, I went to work for Hughes Aircraft Company as a satellite systems engineer. And while I was at Hughes, I met and married my husband. During this time, I also obtained a master's degree in electrical engineering from Caltech, and later a master's degree in international studies from Claremont Graduate University. In the late 1980s, I went to work for RAND, which is a think tank. And on the side, I got active in getting more women elected to public office. I mean, really active. I went to numerous fundraisers, and I met with lots of women. We had lots of women's groups who were also active in trying to get more women elected. I mean, you have to understand, at that time, I knew who every woman in Congress was. I knew who every woman who was a governor was. You could memorize all the names because there weren't that many. And many people said, oh, women won't give money to other women, and also women won't vote for other women. So there were a lot of things that needed to be changed. So I'm really glad I was involved in that, and we did that. I was especially close to now Senator Dianne Feinstein in the early 1990s. So you can imagine how disappointed I was in what she did during the Kavanaugh hearings. But in any event, I set up a lot of aerospace visits for her. I mean, I remember when we traveled to Northrop Grumman and for the B-2 bomber, and it was just the two of us. It was really fun. I really enjoyed supporting her. But during this time, I heard Bill Clinton speak on C-SPAN, and I immediately liked what he had to say. He, like Dianne Feinstein at the time, were pro-business, centrist Democrats who supported all kinds of sensible and pragmatic policies. Believe me, it's not at all like the Democratic Party of today. This led to my involvement in the Bill Clinton campaign for president. I took a leave of absence from my job at RAND to work on his campaign in Little Rock as a member of the issue staff. That's what we called ourselves. We're about 10 of us, where I focused on defense, space, and technology issues. After he was successfully elected, I interviewed with Bill Perry, who was then the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and he hired me to become the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Command, Control, and Communications. I had a commuter marriage, an apartment at the Watergate, and an office at the Pentagon. It was an amazing, amazing experience. And I stayed for 2.5 years. Afterwards, I joined my husband and his brother in a startup where we were developing a hybrid electric powertrain for automobiles. Another amazing experience. But like most startups, we ended up closing. And after that, I started to have time to look into other things. So in addition to doing a lot of traveling and some little startups, but not full time, I started the process, as I look back now, of transitioning from being a Democrat to being a Republican. And it was simple at first. It was about science. As an engineer, I've always loved science. You have to take a lot of science, math, physics, that kind of stuff. You have to take those classes. So early on, I became concerned about the issue of global warming. What puzzles me now, looking back, is this. Why didn't I just accept up front that it was true? So I started to dive in and study the issue. At first, I thought the solution would be more use of nuclear power. In September 2008, my husband and I went to a conference in Washington, D.C. on high-temperature gas-cooled reactors, which is an advanced form of nuclear power. The keynote speaker was Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace. Before he gave his talk, I approached him and told him that I would like to work with him on getting more environmentalists interested in nuclear power. He was friendly and seemed to think it was a good idea. At the end of his very interesting and informative talk, the keynote speech, he said something that stopped me cold. He merely mentioned, in passing, that he didn't believe in global warming. And I wrote him off. I wrote him off. I think back now and ask myself, why wasn't I curious? That would be how a good scientifically minded person would react. Here was a highly intelligent and knowledgeable person. Why wasn't I at least curious as to his reasons? I didn't necessarily have to accept what he had to say, but why wouldn't I want to hear him out? I mention this now because I've come to believe that this attitude is key to the leftist mindset, which clearly I'd bought into. Put people in boxes, label them, accept the dogma, and don't think for yourself. Here's another. Like all good Democrats, I sneered at Fox News. I felt it was horribly biased and simply wrong. But how did I know this? Did I ever watch it for myself? No. By the way, I really like Fox News now. So back to climate change. There are so many brave and really good scientists out there who dispute the climate change alarmism narrative. For the most part, you won't read about them in the mainstream media, which I've found only hypes and publishes the most outlandish claims, giving the public a distorted view of the science and generating lots of funding and attention for those who scare people and make these claims. But there are studies, speeches, and books and YouTube videos disputing the hype out there, and I've pretty much read and seen them all. I've become convinced by the data and reasoning and by the fact that these people, on a personal level, better epitomize to me what careful science is all about. I'd like to say something that I've observed about scientists in general. In my opinion, many scientists are drawn to the study of science. Now, please remember, I'm speaking in generalities here. But they're drawn to the study of science because they want to study nature. And that means stepping back. Because in order to study it, you don't want to alter it when you're studying it. Observe nature as it is. People who go into engineering, on the other hand, alter nature by building things for the betterment of humanity. We don't think nature is great as is. And we tend to work for companies, for businesses. It's for this reason, I think, that I don't find many engineers buying into all the hype regarding climate change. By contrast, many scientists are government funded and work in academic or ivory tower settings. So in my mind, they're not as attuned to real world concerns. And let me ask you this. Do you really think that these people are the right ones to be deciding what our energy economy should be based on? By the way, I include in this category engineers whose livelihood is based on the so-called green economy. Because, surprise, surprise, they tend to be true believers as well. Also, most scientists I know are, by necessity, pretty narrow. They have to specialize in one small area in order to do their work successfully. I find that many of them just accept what they think other scientists are saying and have no time to really look into areas outside their own narrow area of expertise. And maybe also it's an identity thing. But I now also have grown to see it as politically motivated groupthink. Not a conspiracy or anything like that. My mind, I just don't go for conspiracies. It's just that there's so much information out there. So we all kind of need a shortcut. And so we just tend to believe what others in our group think or what we think some authoritative group thinks. But as far as science goes, we've experienced this phenomenon many times in the past, like when the entire scientific community believed in eugenics. So let's cut to the chase here. The reason I became a Republican and voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and by the way, he was my last choice, because at first I was kind of put off by his style. But the reason I voted for him was because of climate change alarmism. I really, really wanted us out of the Paris Climate Agreement. I feared that we were going to ruin a good thing, our energy-based economy, by changing, for example, our electrical grid to so-called renewables, which should be called unreliables. Also, from an environmental point of view, they're landscape intensive. I just think they're horrible. Anyway, I was predisposed because of my former feminist leanings to want to vote for a woman for president. I mean, that'd be a pretty cool thing. But I heard Hillary Clinton say that we should go to 100% renewables. Are you kidding me? Don't ruin a good thing, people. I'm really worried about my state of California, by the way. That's why I have my own generator as a backup for my house. Energy is the lifeblood of our economic system. Sorry, but windmills, solar farms, and electric cars are not going to do that. Not to mention that in order to manage all that, we'd have to have a smart grid, which would be more vulnerable to cyber attack. It's just a terrible system. Also, Fracking has been a huge, huge boost to our economy. We now lead the world in energy production. Take that, Putin. And let's not forget that bad top-down policies can do real harm. In the late 1970s, we were all told to eat more carbs and less fat. And the food industry naturally followed suit in making these low-fat and high-carb foods available. And what happened? Obesity rates skyrocketed. Diabetes became a real concern for a lot of people, type 2 diabetes. And many people suffer from the so-called metabolic syndrome. And it's affected so many of us and the whole world. I mean, really, a cockamamie idea that was supposedly backed up by terrible scientific studies and activists pushing it. It becomes government policy can definitely make things worse, not better. So in my mind, we should think very, very carefully about mixing science and policy. There are exceptions, of course. Vaccination is good and things like that. But during my 6 years or so of changing my mind about the climate change issue, I also started shifting my thinking regarding other related issues. Here's an aspect that I've come to recognize in the leftist mindset. Why are these people so anxious about the future? They are seemingly unable to see that life has gotten better for people around the globe. Statistics bear me out on this. Instead, they just look ahead and see disaster coming. Really? What's going on here? This is not new. It goes all the way back to the late 1700s, early 1800s with Thomas Malthus and his writings about population growth. These writings led the so-called intellectual classes to enact some really horrific policies. And this tendency to jump on bad policies that rest on faulty premises continues to this day. And communism, socialism, fascism, ism. I remember feeling depressed as a young airman, sitting in my dorm room at the Air Force Base in the 1970s, reading articles in magazines about the coming population bomb and how things were going to get really, really bad in the future. I did worry about this stuff. I believed it. Now, for any of you younger people out there listening to this, let me tell you, there's an advantage in getting older because you get perspective. Once you've been through a couple of these scares and seeing that nothing happens, you kind of take a different attitude toward it. But those population scares and projections of doom and mass starvation and horrible stuff, they all turned out to be bogus. Instead, things got better around the world. So, in short, here's what I've come to see about climate change. In my mind, disaster won't come by any slow, secular change, such as a slow, steady rise in sea levels. But it can come from a sudden disaster that we are unprepared for. Some kind of massive earthquake, tsunamis, a supervolcano eruption like Yellowstone. That's what our policies should be focused on. And okay, I'll grant you this. Maybe if we had never, ever had higher carbon dioxide levels than we do now, I might be a little worried. But that's not the case at all. We are historically low levels of carbon dioxide, people. Earth has had higher carbon dioxide levels many, many times in the past, and life, especially plant life, flourished. Here's something else I noticed. If people were really, really worried about carbon dioxide emissions, like the end of the world is coming, we would ramp up our use of nuclear power and hydroelectric power and dams and such. The fact that many of these same people who claim to be so scared of CO2 emissions don't want nuclear power either says to me that this is really about something else. In any event, those computer models that used to try to predict future temperatures have been way off the mark. Instead, the temperatures have plateaued for the last 20 years, despite what you may have heard. I laugh at something once my late husband said about it. He said, "These people aren't scientists, they're modelers." But when we have this plateau in temperatures, to keep the alarm going, the name was changed from global warming to climate change, which means absolutely nothing. At no time in Earth's history has the climate stayed constant. There are all kinds of cycles, including the fact that we are in the interglacial period of an ice age that has been with us about 2.5 million years now. I could go on and on regarding this issue, as there are so many aspects to it, and frankly, I love to think about all of them. Just know that there are plenty of good books and solid internet sites that you can read and look at that will give you all the facts and historical context that you might want to know regarding this subject. One piece of advice, if you decide to look into this issue for yourself: be wary of people who attack the person rather than attack the argument being made. And if they just say, "Oh, that person's a denier," or whatever, that means nothing. What do they say about the argument? One thing that all this personal investigation did for me was that I was already primed to see the fake news media in action well before Trump came on the scene. More recently, many of you watching this video also saw the fake news operating when Brett Kavanaugh was painted on the left as some kind of, what? Sexual abuser? What? An accusation based on no evidence at all. By the way, thanks to all of you who have watched, and many of you gave great, really nice comments on my kind of spontaneous YouTube video on Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, my take. It's amazing. Well over 30,000 views already. But back to politics. I remember when I flipped on President Obama. Remember, things build up in one's mind. When you strongly support someone, it's really hard to let go. But it just builds up. And then one day, it just flips. But before that particular day, if a pollster had come around and asked me, I would have said I supported Obama. I remember it was during his second term, and I read that he was speaking at a college rally of some sort, and he mentioned climate change. And his tone and what he said, it was like he was sneering. He sneered at the so-called climate deniers who did not accept the science. I have to say, at that moment, my heart froze. I was so offended, not just for me, but for all the really good scientists out there. There's just too many names of these great scientists. My president was sneering at me and all those people. I had come to this view, as had many others come to this view, after several years of reading and studying the issue from many different angles. I love science. I've contributed a lot of money to scientific research, by the way. So nobody can dispute my love of science. He could at least respect that. Even, as my president, here's how I felt. He could at least respect that, even if he didn't agree with me and others on this issue. But to sneer? It reminds me of Hillary Clinton and her comment about the deplorables. I kind of stopped watching the Bill Maher show for the same reason. He does the sneer thing, trying to intimidate guests on his show who dare question the climate change narrative. As a result, I see the guests who know better feel compelled to soften their language. Because, of course, nobody wants to be against science. And nobody is against science. I never met a person who's against science, to tell you the truth. But here's the thing. Did I used to be like that? Yeah, I cringe to think of the intellectual arrogance inherent in that mindset. I now see how wrong that was. This is my atonement thing. I'm very sorry that I did that, but it helps me understand. And here's the other thing. I realized that while I was a Democrat and believing all this stuff, I don't think I'd ever be convinced, somebody calling me names or yelling at me. But what stayed with me were the people who were very nice and dignified. And it was really looking at the character of the people. That was part of it. That and the science that made more sense to me. And Earth's history, putting it in the context of Earth's history. That influenced me a lot. And also, I've grown to have an increased appreciation for the wisdom in people who work hard, live their lives, love their families, their country, and their God. I want to thank my wonderful nieces, Lindsay and Jenna, for this. But they're sensible people, and there's others in my life too. And almost all of them are kind people as well. They have better things to do than go around sneering at leftists the way many on the left tend to sneer at them. When I was on the left, by the way, especially like when I was in Washington, D.C. and I'd run into conservatives or Republicans, I don't remember any conservative or Republican ever being rude to me. In fact, I remember them as always being friendly and nice to talk with. This philosophical change within me has also led me to support small government, less regulation, free markets, law and order. Well, I've always been for law and order, supporting the police and the like. So in short, I now call myself a conservative. It's been a big change for me. But let me tell you, like all the many others who are walking away from the left, once your eyes have been opened, there's no going back. I believe societies do change over time. But the best and most lasting kind of change emerges emerges from the bottom up rather than dictates from the top down. In closing, I want to add one more thing. I remember that I liked Jimmy Carter as president. That seems odd now, but I did. And I was younger. He was an engineer. Smart, I thought. And I honestly could not understand why Ronald Reagan beat him in 1980. So I became interested in what makes for a good president of these United States. And over the years, I've read every presidential biography I could lay my hands on. By the way, I've now come to see that Reagan was a very good president. I used to feel that when I was reading these biographies that, I could be president if I was suddenly thrust into the role, as Harry Truman was, as long as I didn't have to campaign for the role of being president. I don't think I'd do well on that. I felt that I could be a president. That is, until Trump came along. So even though he was my last choice, I've now come to see that this guy is off the charts brilliant. His ability to negotiate and read people is like nothing I've ever seen in a president. Also, he's the most honest and transparent president or politician that I have ever observed. You always know what he is thinking. That's usually from his tweets or what he says off the cuff. And I distinguish what he's thinking from what he actually institutes in his policies. They're two different things, but at least you know what he feels about a situation. And I've observed that if you insult him, he will definitely insult you back. But it's on an equal opportunity basis. It's as if he doesn't really see or even notice your race, sex, or creed. He'll just insult you back. Who does that today? Toward everyone else, though, I see him as acting in a kind and thoughtful manner. And yes, of course, he makes some mistakes because he beta tests some things. But he's always willing to shift course if the situation requires it. And of course, his energy is astounding. And I see that day by day, he is learning how to do this job as president better and better. And that translates into a feeling for me that he's tough enough to fight for this country and thus for all of us. No apologies. I feel like every president before him has been a rank amateur by comparison. Well, maybe not every. Lincoln was pretty good, and Franklin Roosevelt, but pretty much every president before him has been a rank amateur by comparison. So despite all the array of forces against him, the constant criticism, and the mainstream media, I think he is indeed making our country great again. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I now believe that President Trump will go down in history as our best president ever. Thanks for listening.